Hello everyone, happy election day. I'm going to get started right away since most of you don't watch this live. Some folks have noticed that when I'm waiting for people to come on, it can take a bit, and I don't want you to have to sit waiting for me to get to the program. And some people are like, you're just sitting there doing nothing for the first 2 minutes as you're waiting for people to come on. So as people come on, we'll welcome them. But if you have any questions, again, today's dedicated to Election Day. As you can see, I voted this morning. And from my home office here, I can see one of our polling places here in East Aurora. And it's been pretty busy, which is good to see. A lot of people out with their children taking them to go vote, which is also great to see. So let's get started. Before I do get started on Election Day, history here is just a little, hate to say it, but self-promotion, but it also helps the Roycroft campus. This weekend I'm doing a presentation virtually on the Roycroft campus website. You can go on and sign up, register for the program, Battle Over the Ballot. And today we're going to talk a little bit about women's suffrage, and here in East Aurora especially. But if you want to dig deep, learn more about it, learn what I've learned about women's suffrage, the movement here in East Aurora, that would be a good program to listen to. I am taking it on the road. There'll be a couple other places that I'll be offering it as well coming up. It was a program I had put together for 2020 in commemoration of the amendment in 1920 that made women's suffrage legal across the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about how we got there. It was a state-by-state thing. But I meant to do that in 2020, and then of course COVID happened, and nobody wanted me to be standing up in front talking to a room full of people, of course. So we did a couple virtual things, but I'm sort of reintroducing this a couple years late. However, I did just read that, and it didn't cross my mind until I read it, that we are just, this November election actually commemorates the anniversary of when Susan B. Anthony was arrested for doing the horrible thing of trying to vote. And so she was arrested along with a bunch of, it was an effort on the part of many women across the country to try to vote and see what would happen, knowing they would get arrested, but draw attention to the cause. So we are still, it's always good to talk about the topic. It doesn't have to be the 100th anniversary to do so. So again, if you have any questions, let me know, put them in the comments. But today, as I was trying to figure out what to talk about related to elections, I am fascinated by elections. Not only is it, you hear this over and over again, and we're probably exhausted by it, about having to go vote, make sure that you do your part for democracy, go vote. But I'm fascinated by, the mechanisms for how we voted, how people in the early days in our communities voted, election campaigns before television and radio, things like that. And as I was going through the research that I've done on it, I've realized that I'm not going to be able to talk about everything today that I want to talk about. So one of the things that came out of it is the mechanisms for how we vote and how people voted in the earlier days, and how the mechanisms for voting evolved over time, and why it's important. We'll talk about that, and how it led to where we are today. So one question I get a lot is about what was it like to vote in the first town election? Well, where we are now, or any community where you are, was most likely part of a previous town. And so that was the case with Aurora and East Aurora, is that we were part of a much bigger town, and the towns got smaller and smaller until we got to the town the way it is today. So the idea, actually, in the earliest days, the idea of a town was much bigger. So essentially, all of Western New York was part of one town. So the first town election, you could say, was held in the early 1800s. And we have an account of the election in 1803, thanks to a man who was there, and I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, but Amzi Wright, and he lived in Attica, and it was the election of 1803. Now, This election would not have had anybody from the town of Aurora, current day town of Aurora, going to this election. And how do I know that as well? We didn't have our first settler of European descent arrive here till 1803, 1804. So we would not have had anybody go. But if we were part of the jurisdiction that was part of this town of Batavia, which was essentially all of Western New York at one point. So if you had lived here, or if you were living in Attica or other communities in the what was known then as the Holland Land Purchase, you would have gone up to what is today Newstead, on what is Route 5 today. And the town, it was been the early town elections, and the town being a much bigger geographic area than it is today. So men, because women weren't allowed to vote yet, would go up to what was Mr. Vandervetter's Tavern along Route 5. And everybody from the territory would go up there for a town meeting. And not only were officers elected for the town supervisors, the superintendents of the poor, we had justices of the peace, highway superintendents. They would also debate issues and laws that would happen. And we'll talk a little bit about what happened later. But the early town meeting is fascinating to me. And thanks to Mr. Wright, who was asked, I believe, by the Erie County Historical Society, now the Buffalo History Museum, years later to recount the meeting. He had said that the men went up to vote, and they all met at Mr. Vandervetter's Tavern. Well, the tavern was too small to have everybody inside for this town meeting, so everybody went outside, and the two candidates for town supervisor, who were, coincidentally enough, Mr. Vandervetter, Peter Vandervetter, and a man named Jotham Bemis. And there were actually two, basically, I don't want to say warring factions, but opposite factions. One from the Buffalo side of the territory of the town of Batavia, and one from the Batavia side. So one of the reasons that the turnout was very, very good, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but one of the reasons they felt so many people showed up from such long distances was because of the territorial rivalry. So there were no voting machines. There were no ballots. In fact, what they did was had both candidates stand in the middle of the road, and this is according to that account. And if you supported Mr. Vandervetter, you stood alongside him, appropriately going toward Buffalo, because that was the side he was on. And then Mr. Bemis stood next to him, and his line would extend out toward Batavia. And literally, you stood by your candidate, and they measured the line, counted the number of people in the line, and whoever had the most people in their line won. And in fact, Mr. Vandervetter, according to this account, had 74 votes, and Mr. Bemis had 70. And so Mr. Vandervetter became the first town supervisor for what we now know today as Western New York. And I would have called shenanigans if I were there, because it seemed, I don't know if Mr. Bemis said anything about this, but it seemed odd that one of the candidates was hosting the election at their tavern. But so be it. Mr. Vandervetter was elected. What I found even more fascinating about this account was that of 153 people who were seen as eligible to vote in this election, 144 men showed up. So that's a big turnout. The election was so important to them that they would travel long distances. And I always think about that when people say, like, they might not have time for voting, or it's such a, they have to find time in the day. And now we have no excuse because we have early voting as well. So it's even more convenient to go vote. But, these folks traveled huge distances just to be able to go to the town meeting and vote. And this election was held in March, so the weather had broke and before the crops went in. But that was just amazing to me. The another thing that was interesting is that the reason they know that there were 153 eligible voters wasn't because there was a board of elections and everyone had to register to vote. According to the account, everybody knew everybody. So they literally stood there and go, who's missing from the territory? Like, we know who should be here or who had bought land. And so they came up with the 153 names, and they were easily able to see who wasn't there and come up with basically the voter roll, just by knowing everyone. Wasn't a secret ballot, but they knew there was one account of this event that said that they knew there was no voter fraud because they knew that everybody there should be there, and they knew how many voters there should be because everyone knew everybody in the early days of Western New York. So I found that fascinating. So I like to think of that whenever I think about going to vote, and you have to go a couple blocks to get here, maybe a little more, but your voting booth, your voting district is right in your own vicinity, in your own town, and these folks traveled miles and miles and miles without a car, without trains, over horrible roads, essentially, in order to participate in democracy. So I think that was very interesting. One interesting part of that, I did say that nobody from Aurora would have been there because we didn't have pioneer European descent settlers here yet. However, Jabez Warren, who was the first settler to come to East Aurora, he participated as a resident of what is today Middlebury out in Wyoming County. So he was settled there, and then later came to what is today East Aurora. So he participated. So a future Auroran participated, but not from our area. So that's another neat little thing. As I had talked about, that they knew that there were no shenanigans going on, that all voters were legally registered, so to speak, at that first election, because they knew everybody, and they knew that whether somebody lived in the community or didn't live in the community. That wasn't always the case as the towns got bigger and bigger. And they ran into a problem. So 1818, the towns kept getting smaller and smaller, so you actually were closer to your town meeting. And after 1818, the town of Aurora, as it is today, the boundaries of it today, the name that we have, Aurora, 1818, the first town meeting was held in 1819. That was when we became Aurora. But even after that, so you'd have a town meeting. Of course, the men would go, women weren't allowed to vote at that point. Oh, and I did forget to mention, so Mr. Jabez Warren, who came, we know he attended that meeting, because we don't know all the names of the people who attended, but we know he was at that meeting because he was elected the overseer highways. So that's why it's important to keep records associated with the November elections for other offices, higher offices. But the town meeting wasn't necessarily just to vote. Like today, we'll go vote for our elected officials, and we'll go to the polling place and vote. And then the town board has, two meetings a month. But back then, there was a meeting of the whole town to come, and part of the business was to elect the town supervisor, the town justices of the peace, the overseer highways. So that was the election of officers for the town was just part of it. And by the 1880s and 1890s and into the 20th century, a bigger deal, the bigger headlines in the Advertiser wasn't who was elected town supervisor, but the propositions, so to speak. And a big one was what they called the alcohol license. So whether we would offer licenses for people to sell alcohol. So people who favored it were called wet, and people who did not favor it were called dry. And a lot of times we think about the West and the South that have dry towns. Well, we actually in New York State still have some, I believe. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, every year the biggest proposition, the biggest bone of contention at the town meeting and argument was whether or not the town should allow the sale of alcohol. And it would bounce back and forth. So it was a very big deal to have voters there. And in fact, in 1896, there was an accusation that at the town meeting there were people who did not live in the town of Aurora, ineligible voters, illegal voters, stuffing the ballot box, so to speak. And actually, at that, the Advertiser had recounted this in the next week's issue and said a couple folks looked around and didn't recognize the people who were there, some of the people who were there, and they started to question it. So what they did was, and this was at the West End Fire Hall. So everybody would meet at the West End Fire Hall for the town meeting, and that's where Willink Financial is today. The building still stands at the West End. And we'll talk about town meetings in a bit and the politics of that. But in 1896, they looked around, saw people they didn't recognize, and so someone called shenanigans and said, wait a minute, these folks don't look familiar. Well, again, there was no Board of Elections registrations, so they didn't know who was eligible. So what they did is took people at their word. But the thing was, is they had to swear an oath before they voted, saying that they were an eligible voter. And the Advertiser recounted this, and it's interesting. The Advertiser claimed that a couple people who they weren't sure actually were eligible voters in the town of Aurora took the oath. But then when confronts a lot of other people, and probably it was a handful of voters, but when they were asked to take the oath, they couldn't do it. Like that meant taking the oath, and actually it was a crime. It still is to take the oath and lie, essentially. So the accusation is that people came with the intention of slipping in and voting on whether the town of Aurora should be wet or dry when it came to alcohol, and when they were caught, they couldn't go through with it. So why would this be a big deal? Well, if you owned a tavern in town and you were selling alcohol and there was the potential for you to be essentially put out of business, you might bring some of your friends from another town. And so that was an interesting borderline, well, not borderline, it was totally risky to do that. But the account, I believe that account that actually happened. The Advertiser did have a little editorial slant to the whole thing. But very interesting. So they weren't really stacking the electorate in order to win votes for town supervisor or a candidate. They were really concerned about this wet-dry question. So the propositions were even more important. But this idea back in the 1800s is the town meeting. Literally, the men of the town would come together for a meeting. There was huge debate. The West End Fire Hall was the venue for a lot of it, but then there was a move to try to get the meeting relocated to West Falls or a more rural area, because even in the late 1800s, getting to the meeting might have been more difficult. So, of course, folks in the rural areas might complain that there was more of a vote from the village than out in the outskirts, so they would try to move the meeting around. And again, they would vote on elected officials, but they would also vote on these propositions. So this 1896 account of alleged illegal voters, and it didn't just happen in Aurora. There was accusations of this happening in the 1890s. Mostly around the wet-dry question, led to some reforms. And actually, in 1903, they merged. We had the town elections in March. They merged the elections in 1903 with the November general election. So town elections were merged, and the idea of a town meeting was kind of went away. And you would elect your town board like we do today at the November election. We would do it today. We don't have town elections this year. It's an off year. But they did that. And then they also instituted a more formal form of registering voters. So it'd be a registration system. And then you would go and your name would be on the register, as opposed to just showing up and hoping someone knew you, or attesting and swearing that you actually lived in the town. And by formalizing the process too, they were hoping to get rid of people, which could potentially happen voting in two towns. So if your town election wasn't necessarily standardized, you could come from Wales and vote in Aurora and vice versa, and help your friends in neighboring towns to get the result they wanted. So they did that. Another thing that happened, one of the questions I got before we went on the live stream today was about the voting machines. And today when I voted, when a lot of you vote, we now use a paper ballot and we fill in the little circles and we send it through the scanner. But many of us remember actually the lever machines and the curtain that closed behind you. Well, those lever machines were actually invented in the 1800s, but actually became popularized a little later. And actually, the town of Aurora, probably a result of some of the issues they were having with the town meeting and people showing up and paper ballots and things like that, purchased in 1901 two U.S. Standard, that was the name of the manufacturer, lever machines for the town elections. And there was a little article in the Easter Advertiser about it. And you could actually go in and practice with the new machine to learn how to use it in the weeks before the actual election day. And those types of machines, not the exact machine, but those types of machine were used for decades, actually till more recently when we went to the paper ballot and the scanning. Those machines, although they may seem like they could have some problems, they were actually quite reliable, and that's why they were used for so many years. Someone had asked me about what happened to those machines, the latest incarnation of the actual lever voting machines. I don't know. That would be a question for the Board of Elections at Erie County. I'm assuming many got scrapped, and I'm assuming some got saved for history purposes. Let's hope. But I do know that the town of Aurora had been using those lever machines since 1901, which was quite earlier than I had thought. So I had mentioned before that men were the ones voting, and that's true. Women did not get the right to vote. And we thought, that we always focus on 1920 and the amendment and nationwide voting. But actually it was a state-by-state issue. So each state, before the constitutional amendment was ratified in 1920, they were allowed to decide whether or not to allow women to vote. So in New York State, we had an effort, and we had an effort right here in East Aurora, a pretty strong one in East Aurora for women's suffrage. Susan B. Anthony did visit East Aurora. There was actually, she was supposed to come in 1888 to speak at the Methodist Church, but she apparently was sick and couldn't make it, I believe, from Chicago. So a replacement speaker was found, but the event was organized by Albert Hubbard of the Roycroft, who later became famous with the Roycroft. And when his second wife Alice came, she was very involved in the women's suffrage movement. And again, I'm speaking this Saturday about this in more detail. But Susan B. Anthony was supposed to come in 1888. She was sick, but then she came in 1901, and we have actually proof that she did come. But the problem is, it wasn't really covered in the local newspaper that much. In a lot of the local newspapers, she spoke at the chapel building on the Roycroft campus. Again, organized by Albert Hubbard and the Roycrofters, but it was overshadowed because they were actually in Buffalo for a conference during the Pan American Exposition. But as we all know, President McKinley was assassinated in September of 1901, and I think it was just a couple weeks after that, she was scheduled to come to East Aurora with a bunch of people who were involved in this movement. And so the assassination overshadowed Susan B. Anthony's visit to East Aurora. Otherwise, I think there would have been a much bigger hoopla about it. But there were two incidents. So they kept fighting and fighting the women's suffrage movement. And what we forget is that we like to think, again, this whole romanticizing history sometimes, that we like to think that everyone supported women's suffrage. Like today, it would be unheard. It's unheard of that women shouldn't be allowed to vote. Well, it's just unfortunately, even in our community, it was a uphill battle. There were some crazy, today we would consider crazy reasons why people didn't want women to vote, and all the way from it would ruin the household, that people would not, women, if they were involved in politics, at some house they would forget the home, all the way to like, why give women the vote, because they would just be voting like their husbands, and so it'd just be doubling the vote anyway, so why don't you just save a bunch of time and cut the vote in half, because they would just be voting the same way as their husbands, because they couldn't think for themselves and they would vote how their husband told them to. So crazy things by today's standards. But so even with the push by the Roycrofters, who were women's suffrage advocates, even with that push, especially after Alice came on the scene, after 1904, 1905, there was still resistance in the community, and it was a small portion of they called them extremist, women, and the men who supported them, who wanted this right to vote. And even a lot of women didn't think it was a good thing. So there was 2 referendums in New York State, and one was in 1915 and the other was in 1917. Well, the first one in 1915, and I thought, oh, well, we know it didn't get passed statewide. But as I was looking up the results, I'm like, well, of course East Aurora supported it. We were home to the Roycroft, right? And the women, a strong suffrage advocate like Alice Hubbard and Beulah Hood. We'll talk about her in a bit, and Clara Fisher, a couple other names. But then I looked at the results, and it was 311 against, 281 for. Now remember, this is the men voting on whether women should be allowed to vote. So in 1915, and this was just a couple months after Alice and Albert Hubbard perished on the Lusitania, so they never got to see any of this happen. Men of the town of Aurora voted against women voting, not by a lot, but enough, and statewide it fell apart too. Other towns surrounding us were worse. It was much more lopsided. Well, then 1917 comes along, and in the weeks they put the resolution, the proposition, back up on the state ballot to allow women to vote, and this time it was different. 529 Aurorans, men, in Aurora voted for it, and 366 voted against it. The 2 things happened here. One is World War I. We became involved in World War I in the meantime, in between the 1915 and 1917 propositions. And 1917, by the way, New York State also passed it. So women were allowed to vote in New York State after 1917. World War I, women were taking stronger roles, more active roles, working, supporting the war effort, and I think that changed the idea of women's involvement, and that they should be involved in and could be involved in politics. Second was in 1915, it wasn't believed. One of the news reports in East Aurora said it wasn't that men who were voting were against women voting. They just didn't care. They just didn't. There were a lot of propositions that they did vote on, and they left that one blank in 1915. And a lot more people voted for it in 1917 because it had become much more prominent. In the weeks leading up to that vote, the Roycroft hosted a lot of speakers who were in favor of suffrage, and I think in 1915 things were taken for granted maybe, and so in 1917 they pushed that vote. So today, as I was thinking about this and women's suffrage, and we always think of the Susan B. Anthonys and the prominent folks here in East Aurora, Alice Hubbard, who was involved in the Roycroft. But for every Alice Hubbard and every Susan B. Anthony, there was a Clara B. Fisher. And I always like to talk about Miss Fisher. She lived at the corner of Walnut and Prospect Avenue. And many people who remember her remember that she was a woman with a lot of cats. She enjoyed cats. But I like to remember her as a woman who was involved in women's suffrage. And if you go through all There's a lot of things in the paper about the suffrage movement in East Aurora. Her name is on it, and not prominently. It's that she would send out the postcards to advertise the local suffrage meetings. She would be setting up the meetings in her home or in other people's homes. She would be sending the notices to the newspaper. She'd be the contact person. So she was doing a lot of this legwork, and she didn't have the notoriety of it. So there are people, women and men, in a lot of communities like East Aurora that were doing the legwork and behind the scenes, and not the Susan B. Anthony's, who were doing the work to make this happen. And so I like to think of her. And a couple years ago, actually, the election of 2016, the tradition was started where folks put their stickers on Susan B. Anthony's grave. And a couple years ago, and I might go down there today at Oakwood Cemetery, Clara Fisher's there, and her grave is there, and I put my sticker on hers just as a thank you for her. And just remembering the folks who, it's not just one person, not one star. In each of our little communities like East Aurora, there was a whole group of people that was working toward women's suffrage. There were also people who were working against it. And that I'll get into when I talk about this on Saturday and during my program that I'll be offering in the future. But we forget that there was actually an active movement against women's suffrage right here in East Aurora as well. So we like to, again, celebrate the women who were for it, but sometimes we like to kind of bury the other side of the equation, which was just as active in our community. So we have to study both sides to kind of figure out where people were. The last thing about elections I want to talk about today before we go, and if you have any questions, please let me know. And again, I think we'll talk a little bit more about voting patterns and things like that. There's some really interesting the demographics of our small towns and how people vote. And we like to paint our towns red and blue when there's a huge purple area in the middle. And sometimes we feel a town or a city or a jurisdictional area voting district is red or blue when in fact it's closer to being in the middle. And it's fascinating if you really look at the numbers, and there's throughout history. So maybe we'll talk about that next time. But the last thing today, when we're talking about how people vote, and it really is about how every vote counts, especially in a local town election, small town, and how important it is to go vote. And so I just want to leave with this discussion about how East Aurora became East Aurora. We had essentially two communities, one up by the Vidler end of town, Vidler's and theater end of town was East Aurora. And then at the other end of town had been the village of Willink. And in 1874, because the communities were starting to grow closer together, the village of Willink, which was named for a Holland Land Company landlord, an agent of this company, who, by the way, had never set foot in our community as far as we know. They basically named towns after themselves. So when the village came along to form a village, they named it Willink. And in 1874, because the communities were growing closer together, so from the Circle end of town to the Vidler's end of town, starting to grow toward each other, they voted to expand the boundary line of the village of Willink. And villages, of course, are governments within the town that can provide additional services. So that vote went through. They expanded the village of Willink. So the village, for a short period of time, the village of Willink was the name of what is present-day East Aurora. So the Erie County Board of Supervisors at the time allowed the new community to pick its name, and they had to choose between the names that were already in existence, East Aurora and Willink. And so they held a vote at a store. That's how they did it. There was no town hall at the time, so a local shopkeeper opened a store, and they had the people come in and vote, the men. On June 2nd, 1874. And they voted between keeping the name Willink or changing it to East Aurora. Remember, Willink was the name of the expanded village at that point. 225 people came out to vote, and that was average at the time of our population. 122 voted for East Aurora, 103 voted for Willink, a 19 vote difference. And they believe that it was territorial, that the people liked the name they already have, and so most of the people stuck with the name of their own little communities. However, if only a couple people had switched, a dozen people had switched their votes, we would today be living in the village of Willink rather than the village of East Aurora, and we would have a village named after an absentee landlord, essentially. And a lot of folks saying like Willink, that sounds a little weird. We've gotten used to East Aurora, but that just goes to show you that of the impact of your vote. And so right here we can learn from our local history about how important it is to vote. That I could be doing local history live from the village of Willink instead of the village of East Aurora if only a couple people had voted differently, or if a couple people didn't show up. That's even more important. So I want to leave you with that, what we can learn from history. Again, thanks. If you have not voted yet, please do get your sticker. And anytime, if you're not watching live, feel free to leave a comment in the comments. Any questions you may have about election history, I'd be glad to answer them if I can, if I know the answer to them. Any topics that you want to hear that aren't even related to elections, I'd love to hear those too. So, and lastly, I also want to thank the East Aurora Advertiser. If you didn't see it, they did a great article about this project, this live stream. So if you want to read it, it's at eastaurorany.com on their website. And I also linked to it on this page if you want to read it. And I want to thank Shelley and the Advertiser for highlighting this project. It's been fun so far, so hope to keep doing it. Again, thanks for joining me, and go vote. Have a good day.